Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2023 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Strike, Founder and Festival Director, in conversation with Michael and Stephen Yellen, the team behind the film Jerry's Last Mission, which you can see as a part of the 2023 festival. And now let's welcome Steve and Michael.
Thank you.
Hi guys.
Thank you.
Great to
Hi.
see you. And Steve, you're answering the first question, right?
I believe so, yes.
So tell us about the film.
Well, the film is an extraordinary journey in one man's life who was involved in World War II as a combat P-51 pilot based on Iwo Jima, who flew 19 missions, long-range missions over Japan. Half his squadron was killed in the war. He came back to the United States. He had a severe case of undiagnosed PTSD, and he was a very tortured man inside, and he hated the Japanese. And then in early 1980s, my youngest brother went to Japan and decided that he wanted to live in Japan. And he met a girl, Japanese girl, and he wanted to marry this girl. And her father was a trained kamikaze pilot who later on became a mechanic. And he told her, "You can marry anyone you want." He hated the Americans, but an American. Finally, the two got married and the two fathers met. And part of the film is that there was a deep reconciliation of my brother's father, my father, and his wife's father, the reconciliation of the hatred they had for each other's country through the marriage of their children. And then my father subsequently began the practice of transcendental meditation, healed himself, realized that war does not solve any problems, and the last 3 or 4 years of his life traveled really all over the country, spreading the message of peace, that we are all connected on a fundamental level, that war does not solve anything, and that we need to look for other solutions in order to resolve conflicts.
Well, that is exactly why we chose this film, because of that arc, that journey that your father goes on. And Michael, can you talk a little bit about, normally I'm talking to documentary filmmakers who weren't related to their subject. And since this was a story about your father, how did you go about finding a filmmaking team and even making the decision to create a film about your father's life?
Well, it really happened, not because of Stephen and myself. It happened because Jerry and my mom, my father and my mother were living in Iowa, in Fairfield, Iowa, where there's a large TM community, and my dad was very gregarious. He would talk to anybody, sitting next to him, no matter where you were, and he had a very compelling story, and he liked to tell that story. As Stephen just mentioned. And he actually was in a swimming pool, and he met a young filmmaker, Luisa Marino, in the swimming pool in the middle of Iowa. And they got into a conversation. She heard a story, fell in love with the story, and wanted to make a project, a documentary out of his life. And so that, I think, happened, Steve, remind me, I think it's like 2015 or so, in that ballpark. And she spent 2 or 3 years, or maybe it was 2 or 3 years, following him around between the United States and Japan, and made this documentary. And then she brought on board a couple of more experienced filmmakers, because this was actually her first documentary film. And she brought aboard these other experienced filmmakers, and they put it together. And so really, we were on the side. Myself and a close friend of Jerry and my mom, who lived in Iowa, were executive producers of the film. So we provided some funding and what. But really, it was her idea and her brainchild, and the three filmmakers put it together. And fortunately, Jerry, just before he died, got to see a rough draft of it and really liked it. It wasn't the finished draft; it's not the draft that folks will see at the film festival. But he was really moved by it, and he liked it. And then 2 weeks later, he died. So at least he got to see something before before his life was over.
Well, you mentioned that he loved to tell his story. So this film is going to carry on that
Exactly.
ability to tell his story. So that must have been a kind of comfort to him.
So yeah, no, his story resonated with everybody he spoke to, and I think Steve, it goes back even further than a couple of years that he traveled around. He was going around. He actually wrote his autobiography in I think in the late '80s, his first edition of his autobiography, and he would travel pretty much throughout the United States, and also he's been to Japan like multiple dozens and dozens of times, and talked to people, and just resonated. His story resonated with people. First he's all these soldiers who fought in these wars were heroic, right? I mean, they did things extraordinary, and he survived. He survived Iwo Jima. He landed on Iwo Jima 3 weeks after the Marines invaded the island. So they were still fighting on Iwo Jima. His squadron landed on the island, and so people resonated with that, with the bravery and just World War II soldiers. But what he did afterwards, in terms of his overcoming PTSD and the reconciliation that he had with the country and the people that he hated. I mean, he talks about really hating the Japanese from the '30s, from what they were doing in China and the newsreels that were coming over into the United States at that time. And then when they bombed Pearl Harbor, forget it. He just wanted to get revenge. But then his whole life changed in his later years with my brother marrying a Japanese woman whose father had been slotted to be a kamikaze pilot with only 4 hours of training and a zero. Meanwhile, my dad had like 400 hours of training in his P-40, P-41s, and then P-47, and then P-51, I should say. And so it's just a remarkable story that just resonated with people of this reconciliation, of this healing, and I think it resonated before he died. I think it still resonates after his death, and this movie is a legacy of that.
Well, Stephen, and then I'll go back to you, Michael, to ask you the same question. There very often World War II veterans were known for not telling their stories immediately after the war. And so, as this process of the filmmaking happened, did you learn things about your father that surprised you?
During the filmmaking, I learned things about my father I never knew. And it was quite startling, because growing up, when you're a young kid, you live in your own world. And I had 3 brothers, and we all lived in our own world. And we were very athletic, played a lot of tennis, and we had our own lives. But I never knew, and Michael never knew, and my mother, bless her soul, never knew, my other brothers, the torment that my father went through. And I think the most startling revelation took place in an interview where he said, which I did not know, Michael did not know, my mother did not know, that he thought about suicide every week for 30 years. He worked in an office building in New York City, 7th Avenue and 30th Street, and he thought about jumping off and just ending his life. When I heard that, you could have knocked me over with a feather, because in a million years, I never would have thought that, because there were very many strong qualities about my father, but the torment and the memories burned in his heart and his soul for so many years that, and he told me specifically, Stephen, if I had not learned how to meditate, I don't think I would have made it. I would have imploded. So that really was quite a revelation. I know for me, and I'm sure for Michael and my other brothers as well. And fortunately, he died. He passed away an extraordinarily fulfilled man who thought that he was living the best years of his life when he was 91, 92, 93 years old.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head that these veterans really didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about it. I didn't. The only thing I knew about the war was he had a few mementos or whatever from his time on Iwo Jima, or souvenirs. He had a dagger, if I remember correctly, and he had like a bloody rising sun flag from Iwo Jima. And again, he was on the island while they were still fighting on Iwo Jima. In fact, it talks about in the film how it was tormented by the sights of the war, of seeing mounds of bodies being bulldozed into graves, and it was just a horrendous experience. But he never talked about it, and he had these things at home that eventually he had to get rid of. He gave away his medals. He gave away anything he had from the war to the San Diego Air and Space Museum. At that point, he was living in San Diego. So I really didn't know much. None of us knew much about the war except that he was a P-51 fighter pilot. And we were young and really didn't ask much about it. And he never spoke about it. And he kept his silence until the last couple of decades of his life. And, he wrote about it in his autobiography from the late 80s. And actually the catharsis came when and it talks about this in the movie. It was my birthday. We were living in San Diego, and we went to see the movie Platoon. So whatever year that was. And at the very end of that movie, they're showing bodies being bulldozed into a mass grave. And we're at the movie, and he breaks down crying and hysterically crying. And I had no clue why he was crying. And afterwards, he told us that's what it was like on Iwo Jima. And that was sort of like a catharsis, because after that he started to talk about it, and it just sort of crescendoed. And then in his later years, that's what his mission was to talk about his war experiences, so that others hopefully would not have to go through such a war experience in the future. And that was his true hope. The movie ends with him talking about how we're all the same, and all the same in the eyes of nature, and that we need to do better than we're doing now.
Well, that's a great segue into, the reason we chose a film like this for the Global Peace Film Festival is one of our missions is to inspire people to take lessons or models from the films that they see back into their own lives and into their own communities, to make the world a better place, a more just, peaceful place. And so, Stephen, I'll start with you. What do you hope people take away from seeing this film?
Two things. One, they realize that war does not solve any problems. No war has created peace in the world. There's never been a war that has created peace. It just creates temporary peace, and then there's another conflict. So war is not the answer. Actually, three things. Two, we're all connected. We're all connected on a very fundamental level. On a superficial level, everyone has their own lives, everyone has their own interests, everyone has their own passions. But on a deeper level, and my father, he felt this on the deepest possible level, we are all connected. We are all part of the human race. And what affects one affects everybody. And then the third thing, my father's personal journey had a fairy tale ending at the end of his life. It really was a fairy tale ending. Someone who went through what he went through, and that carried so much hatred in his heart for another people, another culture, begins this practice of meditation, transcendental meditation, and he heals himself. And I would say to all the veterans, to all the policymakers around the world, to all the government officials that are making laws, that unless you create peace in an individual's heart, mind, and soul, we are never going to live in a peaceful world. So I would hope that people would explore the benefits of meditation, of transcendental meditation, and go through the same transformation that my father did.
Thank you. And Michael?
Well, I don't think I can really expand beyond what Steve said. I think it's an inspirational film for people to heal. There's so much war now going on in the world that still, and it's going to continue that way until we come to the realization that we're all connected and on this small little blue dot floating around in space. So I just hope people get inspired by it, and maybe it'll make a small difference, and maybe it'll blossom into a big difference. I don't know.
Well, that's a wonderful thought, and I certainly hope everybody watching this looks for this film, comes to the Global Peace Film Festival to see our screenings, but also seeks it out after that. So can you tell us what people can do to support this film and where they can find it, and also what's next for the two of you?
So first of all, hopefully lots of people come to the film festival and support the film festival and see Jerry's Last Mission. The film is available for streaming, for rental or purchase on Amazon Prime. Just found that out recently. I didn't know that. As well as Apple TV. And then what we're doing is we're submitting the film to as many film festivals as we can, and trying to get the word out. And then he also has several books. He wrote several books, including starting with his autobiography. But he also wrote 3 other books, including a novel, a historical novel. I mean, Stephen said he was in the prime of his life in his later decades, and it was unbelievable what he was doing in his 80s and 90s. So we're just trying to get the word out to support the film and just keep his memory and legacy alive.
Well, that sounds great. And thank you both for taking the time and for sharing all of your memories and insights about your remarkable father's remarkable life. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. It was an enjoyable experience talking.
Great. And I hope everyone out there watching The Glow, I want to thank you for watching. And I hope that you do follow through and check out more about Jerry's Last Mission. And you can find out more information by going to jerryslastmission.com. And please do go to peacefilmfest.org to learn everything about our schedule. Our in-person screenings begin September 19th and run through September 23rd. Our virtual programming begins September 25th and runs through October the 1st. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next Glow.